I never expected to share the darkest chapter of my life with strangers online, but I need to get this off my chest. My dad was the best man I've ever known. He taught me everything that mattered: respect, hard work, kindness. He was my hero. When I was 10, he passed away suddenly. My world collapsed, and I needed my mom more than ever. But she had other plans. Rather than hold our small family together, she abandoned me. She put me up for adoption, all so she could run off with my dad's brother. I was completely devastated. At the adoption center, I felt like an unwanted stray. Nobody explained anything properly. I was too young to understand legalities, but I realized that she didn't want me around. I remember overhearing my mother telling a social worker she couldn't handle me after Dad died, that she needed a fresh start. That fresh start happened to be with my uncle, who had always made me uncomfortable. I despised how easily she replaced the man who loved us both. I just wanted someone to fight for me, but no one did. I felt tossed aside and powerless to stop it. A few families came and went, showing vague interest. Some asked me weird questions about my background or how I dealt with discipline. I wasn't a troubled kid, but losing my dad and being betrayed by my mom left me guarded. Eventually, a couple who couldn't have children chose me. They were middle-aged and seemed kind. They never tried to replace my parents, nor force me to call them mom or dad. They gave me space to grieve and offered therapy. They didn't have a fancy house or lots of money, but they gave me a home. I felt safe. I was adopted at 11. My new parents treated me gently, allowing me time to adjust. They never forced affection, but it grew naturally. I was hesitant at first, worried they'd give me up too. Instead, they became my rock. I began calling them mom and dad around age 14, which made them cry with joy. School was tough at first because I had trouble trusting anyone, but eventually, I made a couple of good friends. My life stabilized, though I still carried wounds from my biological mother's decision. That abandonment never stopped hurting, but I learned to keep going. Years passed. I graduated high school, went to a local community college, and then transferred to a university. My adoptive parents helped whenever they could, and I worked part-time jobs to cover tuition. I majored in business, hoping to build a stable future. I kept my adoption story quiet. Some friends knew, but I rarely spoke of my biological mother. I tried to push the memory away, but it found me anyway. One day, I got a friend request on a social media platform from a woman with a familiar face. She had the same name, my mother. I froze. My heart pounded. She wore a smile in her profile picture, but it felt like a cruel joke. I couldn't believe she'd want contact after all those years. I debated ignoring her. However, curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked. Her profile was to look normal, but I spotted glimpses of a new life. She'd had 2 more kids with my uncle. All her photos radiated a happy vibe. I resented the thought that she'd enjoyed a family while discarding me. Before responding, I showed the request to my adoptive mom, who told me, "Do what feels right." I accepted the request and waited. Within minutes, she messaged me a tearful apology for everything. She wrote that she'd made mistakes, that she was young and overwhelmed when my father died. She claimed she never stopped loving me, that she simply couldn't cope back then. She wanted to meet. She said all the right words, but it felt off. I was no longer that naive kid she abandoned. A simple apology wouldn't erase the years of loneliness. But I still wanted answers, so I told her I'd think about it. My emotions tangled, part of me craving real closure. I talked it through with my adoptive parents. My adoptive dad warned me to be careful, reminding me of the pain I'd already endured. I reached out to my best friend, who knew bits and pieces of my story. He advised me to meet her in a public place, with caution. So I did. She chose a cafe near her home. I arrived first, anxious. When she walked in, she looked older, but still recognizable. She opened with tears, hugging me before I had a chance to react. I let her. I needed to see her eyes. I saw regret. She launched into a sob story about how hard life had been, how she'd tried to locate me but couldn't. She implied that the adoption agency blocked her attempts. She said she'd always regretted letting me go. She told me my father's death destroyed her, that my uncle was her source of support. I listened, waiting for her to mention the new family she built. Eventually, she did, but she framed it as an accident, claiming she never intended to replace me. Her words poured out in a rehearsed style like she'd practiced them. Something felt staged. I stayed quiet. Once she finished her monologue, she asked if I'd be willing to visit her home, meet my siblings, and start fresh. She claimed everyone wanted to meet me. I said I'd think about it, paid for my coffee, and left. Her tears hadn't moved me the way she might have hoped. I felt more suspicious than ever. Later that night, I went through her online profiles again. I discovered posts about mounting medical bills for her youngest child. She'd set up crowdfunding pages. Suddenly, her timing made sense. She probably hoped I'd help financially. Anger simmered in my chest, resentment. I decided to play along. I messaged her back, saying I'd like to meet my siblings, get to know them, and reconnect as she suggested. She responded immediately, thrilled. She invited me for dinner on a Friday. I accepted, telling her I had come alone. In truth, I didn't trust her, so I told my best friend where I'd be and made sure he'd check in on me. When I arrived, my uncle greeted me at the door, trying to act fatherly. It made my skin crawl. They guided me into a living room that felt more completely staged than genuine. My siblings were 2 boys, ages 9 and 12. They seemed polite. The older one had my dad's eyes, which rattled me. They were told I was a cousin visiting from out of town, but my mother quickly clarified that I was their half-brother. The kids seemed confused, but they politely nodded. My uncle tried to engage me in small talk, referencing how we were family. I forced a tight smile and said little. My mother asked me countless questions about my job, my salary, whether I had health insurance. She was trying so hard to conceal her real motives. When the meal ended, she finally addressed what she really wanted. She tearfully described how her younger son needed a pricey medical procedure soon. They'd exhausted insurance options and the hospital demanded upfront payment. She said she hoped I could help a little. My uncle chimed in, saying families should support each other. I stared at them, recalling how little family meant when they cast me aside. I asked bluntly, "Is that why you reconnected?" She tried to deny it, but her face gave everything away. I felt rage boiling, but I pretended to be sympathetic. I wanted more information. I said I'd consider helping, but I needed time. My mother looked relieved. My uncle gave me his phone number, urging me to call any time. I left, feeling sick. The moment I stepped outside, I wanted to scream. It was clear they only reached out because they needed money. My half-brothers were innocent in this mess, and I hated that one of them was sick. Still, I couldn't forget how easily she'd tossed me away. My father's memory kept surfacing, reminding me that I deserved better. So I resolved not to let them off the hook. They'd never apologize properly. Over the next week, I acted distant online, only responding to her messages with short answers. She tried to schedule another meeting to discuss logistics. I pretended I was busy with work. Meanwhile, I contacted an old friend who became a lawyer. I asked hypothetical questions about parental responsibility, inheritance, and anything relevant. Nothing they did was technically illegal. I wanted to see if I had leverage. Then I had an idea. My father's will. My adoptive parents gave me access to a box of old documents. In it, I discovered something shocking. My dad had left me a trust fund. It wasn't massive, but enough to pay for college or a down payment on a house. The trust had been locked until I turned 18. My mother, as the surviving spouse, was supposed to manage it for my benefit. Instead, she signed away her rights, relinquishing me and the fund. The money sat untouched, eventually transferred into my name when I was adopted. I realized she must have forgotten about it or assumed it no longer existed. Now I saw a route to justice. She was begging for money, unaware I had a chunk of my father's legacy in my possession. I waited until she reached out again. She asked if I'd decided. I said I might help, but wanted assurance about her sincerity. She acted offended, but I pressed on. I asked for proof of expenses and details about the procedure. She sent me copies of bills and doctor recommendations. My half-brother's condition was serious. I felt for him. Still, I recalled how she cast me away. My father would have wanted me to help a sick child, but not at the expense of my dignity. I decided to gather as much evidence of her manipulation as possible before confronting her. Over time, I coaxed her into revealing more. She freely admitted she'd ended our relationship to be with my uncle, that she regretted it every day. She insisted that life was cruel to her, that she had no choice. She completely downplayed her betrayal, framing herself as a victim. I recorded our phone calls, saving screenshots of her messages. Every word confirmed my suspicion. She wanted money, not reconciliation. Meanwhile, I confided in my adoptive parents, who supported whatever choice I made. My anger grew. She'd used me as a pawn, and now she expected me to bail her out. I didn't want to punish my half-brother. He was just a kid who needed help. Still, my mother and uncle deserved consequences, so I concocted a plan. I told her I was ready to pay the full amount for the procedure. She cried with relief, thanking me. I set up a time to deliver the check in person. I also hinted I'd like us all to go public with our reconciliation. She loved that idea, probably hoping it would guilt me into continued support. I arranged for a gathering at my adoptive parents' place, telling her it'd be a celebration. On the chosen day, my adoptive parents and a few close friends were present. My mother and uncle arrived with my half-brothers. My mother wore a forced smile, greeting everyone like it was some grand reunion. We all sat down, and I announced I had something to share. I said, "I've prepared a statement." That got their attention. I pulled out my phone and played recordings of her admitting she gave me up for my uncle, mocking my dad's memory, and acknowledging she wanted my money. Her face drained of color. My uncle stood, demanding I stop, but I continued. They tried to snatch my phone, but my adoptive dad stepped between us. I recited the years of silence, how she never tried to find me until she needed cash. I showed screenshots of messages revealing her intentions. My friends and parents looked disgusted. My mother started crying, claiming I misunderstood everything, accusing me of twisting her words. I refused to let her guilt me. I told them the trust fund existed and that I had enough money to pay for the medical procedure, but I wouldn't give them a cent. I reminded her she abandoned me for her desires. My uncle shouted that I was punishing a child, insisting I had no heart. I stared him down, reminding him of his own betrayal. He was Dad's brother, yet he'd seduced my mother and broken our family. He had no right to accuse me of cruelty. I looked at my half-brothers, who were clearly frightened. I told them gently that I wasn't punishing them, but I couldn't support people who only saw me as a bank. I felt torn, but my bitterness ran deeper. She'd made her bed. My father's name deserved respect, and I wouldn't let them exploit it. My mother begged me to reconsider, falling to her knees. She swore she'd do anything, that she'd make it right. I felt zero sympathy. I told her she made her choice long ago. She and my uncle could figure out how to pay for their child's medical care. The rest of us all watched in silence. I handed her a stack of printed messages, showing her attempts to manipulate me. Then I calmly asked them to leave. My adoptive father said, "You heard him," opening the door. My mother sobbed, but they eventually left, dragging my confused half-brothers with them. After they left, I broke down. My adoptive mom hugged me, reminding me that I wasn't at fault. Everyone reassured me that I had every right to publicly expose the truth. The next day, I posted an account of what happened on social media, clarifying that my mother had returned only when she wanted money. I attached evidence of her manipulative messages and explained why I refused to pay. I disabled comments on the post because I didn't want a debate. I just wanted the truth out there. This was my way of ensuring she couldn't twist the narrative anymore. Friends and acquaintances who never knew the full story offered support. A few distant relatives reached out, condemning my mother and uncle for their actions. Some tried to persuade me to pay for my half-brother's surgery anyway, but I refused. It wasn't my responsibility. I wasn't going to reward their manipulation. If they truly desperately needed help, they could approach legitimate charities or take out a loan. My mother bombarded me with tearful voicemails, insisting she'd change, that she loved me. I deleted them all. I knew this wasn't genuine remorse. She only cared because I had something she wanted. Months passed. My mother and uncle eventually stopped calling. I heard through relatives that they managed to fund the procedure through donations and loans. My half-brother recovered, which was a relief. I'd never wished harm on him. Still, I remained firm in my choice. My father's trust fund stayed intact. I eventually used part of it for a business venture, fulfilling my dad's dream for me to have a stable future. Every so often, I'd receive a message from my mother, begging for a conversation. I ignored them. She'd burned her bridges, and I had no interest in rebuilding them. I carried guilt for a while, wondering if I'd gone too far. But every time that doubt crept in, I remembered the lonely nights in foster care, the heartbreak of losing Dad, and the cruelty of her abandonment. She never reached out on my birthdays, never sent a single letter. She only reappeared for money. That wasn't love. My therapist helped me understand that my anger was valid. It wasn't petty revenge. It was protecting myself from further hurt. My adoptive family gave me the love and stability she refused to provide. They earned my loyalty, and she lost hers. Today, I'm building the life my dad wanted for me. I graduated college, started a business, and even bought my first home. My adoptive parents remain my biggest supporters. Occasionally, I'll get messages from extended family trying to mediate, but I block them. I don't need to be dragged back into drama. My mother made her choices. She betrayed my father's memory and my trust. I refuse to spend my life fixing her mistakes. Sometimes it still stings, but I won't let her toxic manipulations define me. I have no regrets about cutting her out. This is my final closure. I've shared all this here because I want others to know they're not obligated to ever forgive people who cause deep wounds. If someone betrays you, you owe them nothing. Sometimes the best way to honor yourself and those you love is to cut ties with toxic people. My mother underestimated how strong I could become once I escaped her grasp. She probably counted on me being forever desperate for her acceptance. But I built a new life with a real family. That's how I won. She might live with regret, but I won't let her regrets become my burden. So that's my story. It's not the fairy tale reunion some might expect, but it's real. I've learned that sometimes standing your ground is the only way to heal. I hope this helps anyone facing a similar situation. I can't say I'm proud of every harsh word I said, but I don't regret refusing her demands. My dad raised me to be strong, and my adoptive parents showed me what genuine love looks like. I feel whole, and I refuse to let her betrayal haunt me any longer. Revenge isn't always sweet, but this was satisfying enough for me. Thank you.